This week our discussion focuses on the work of Aristotle, who was another one of the great philosophers of ancient Greece. Aristotle was a student of Plato at Plato's Academy, and in turn he opened his own school known as the Lyceum. And one of the key texts that comes from his school is known as the Nicomachean Ethics. Most of what we have of Aristotle's writings are actually lecture notes, lectures that he gave at his school, and so if it's written in a little less of a dramatic form than Plato's dialogues, it's because these are lecture notes. So not necessarily as exciting to read, but they're packed with great insights. And this is a text that's important for our study of ethics and morality because it's one of the central texts in the tradition known as virtue ethics. So it's concerned with how to live well, how to govern well, how to educate well, and doing those things well requires virtue. Remember, virtue means excellence. So it's focused on identifying and forming the virtues, the excellences of character that allow us to live and to act well. And it's called the Nicomachean Ethics because it's named either after Aristotle's father or his son. They're both named Nicomachus. So it's dedicated either to his father or his son. And that's appropriate because the text has a lot of concern with this question of transmission of wisdom and virtue from one generation to the next. Now, Aristotle begins by identifying the aim of all activity. He says everything that we do aims at some good. And so the question that comes up is whether there's some ultimate good, some highest or overarching good that all of our activities aim at. And he says everything we do is ultimately aiming at happiness. Now that needs a little bit of a comment because if we hear the word happiness in English, we're probably inclined to think it's a sort of good mood. Maybe it's a passing emotion. You can be happy one day, unhappy the next, depending on the weather or how circumstances are going. What Aristotle's talking about isn't just a simple emotional state, being happy or sad. The Greek word that he uses is eudaimonia, and that means literally having a good spirit. But it refers to something deeper than just mood or emotion. It's probably better translated in some ways by the term flourishing. So eudaimonia refers to flourishing as a human being. Flourishing according to the kind of being that one is. So it has this sense of living well. And Aristotle says at one point, this isn't something that sort of comes and goes. It's an attribute or a characteristic of a whole lifetime. He describes it as activity of the soul in accord with virtue or excellence. So flourishing or happiness, eudaimonia, this is activity of the soul in accord with virtue. And so when we're acting well, when we're doing well, that's what allows us to thrive as human beings. Now, the big question then is, what are these virtues? What does this look like concretely? And so the discipline that studies this is what Aristotle calls here political science. And it's a little bit different from the way that we may think of political science now. Like if you studied political science in the university, there's overlap asking questions like, what is the best regime? This is a question Aristotle and Plato, these philosophers, took up. Is it democracy or aristocracy? Is it some sort of oligarchy? These were questions that they sought to answer. So there are parallels. In some ways, maybe what he means by political science is closer to political philosophy. Was asking these sorts of questions. And he points out early on that this is not an exact science. So you shouldn't approach this like mathematics or expect the precision of mathematics, because we're dealing with human beings. Human affairs are more variable than mathematics or geometry. That doesn't mean that they're less true or real. He is looking for true insights here, objective reality. He's not just talking about subjective opinions. But when you're dealing with human affairs, you're dealing with variability. And so what this requires isn't just a sort of formula, but instead it requires prudence or practical wisdom. And that takes time. Now, this is also going to be quite different from what we see in utilitarianism in a couple weeks, where we see the argument that there should be a sort of calculus for determining what is the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. And this is something that Aristotle would have thought was just fundamentally misguided. It's not possible to calculate what the right thing to do is with some sort of mathematical formula. Now, part of this then requires the study of the soul. He said if you want to do well in politics, be a good politician, cultivate a good political regime, a good city, you need to study the soul. You need to know what human nature is like, in other words, what kind of beings humans are. Now, for Aristotle, the soul is a principle of life. And this is a passage that comes from his book On the Soul. And so that means it's different from the way we might think of the soul in sort of everyday language. A lot of people imagine the soul as a kind of ghostly substance that inhabits the body. That's not how he thinks of it. Instead, the soul is the organizing principle of a living body. So it's what organizes matter into this or that particular form of life. And so Aristotle's actually going to argue plants have a certain kind of soul, animals have a certain kind of soul, and humans have another kind of soul. Not because they're all spiritual beings in some way, but because they're matter organized to be a living, organic unity. So soul organizes matter then into a distinct form, and it gives it a characteristic function or activity. A distinctive sort of function or activity that makes it the kind of life that it is. So one of these kinds of functions is what Aristotle calls the nutritive soul, and that's the soul that we find in plants. And so the characteristic function of a plant then is nutrition. It takes in nutrients through the soil, it gets water, it gets sunshine, and it converts those nutrients into itself. So it grows and it bears fruit, and it's able to drop seeds that cause more of that form of life to spread. So that would be the characteristic function of plants. Now that's something that animals also have. Animals also have that nutritive function. They take in food, metabolize it, it becomes part of themselves, and they grow. But they also have another distinctive function. So they have the nutritive function, but they also have the sensitive function, by which Aristotle means they have senses. They can see and hear, smell, touch, taste. They're able to move around as well, which is another characteristic activity of animals. But he focuses in this reading on the sensitive soul. So sense perception is what is the characteristic function of animals. Now, human beings have both of those functions. We have the nutritive function. We also have sense perception. But there's something unique about the human soul. So the human soul has another characteristic function that distinguishes us from other animals, and that is reason or rational discourse. We are animals that have the logos. Logos is a Greek word for reason, language, rational discourse. It sort of encompasses all of those ideas, and Aristotle uses that to distinguish us from other animals. We have understanding. And so that means that it's possible for us to live in a different way from other animals. Okay? We live together, we form communities that are based on shared principles, laws, rather than just instinct. We reason about the best course of action, about what's right or wrong. And we're capable of happiness in a unique way. Aristotle says in the reading that animals don't share in happiness. Now, they may be able to have a good mood, but they don't possess virtue in the uniquely human way, which is exercising this rational function, being able to decide on the right course of action, being able to live well according to that. So the highest activity then of the human being is understanding. He says all humans by nature desire understanding, or we desire to know. This is an argument he makes in another book of his known as the Metaphysics. And Aristotle's argument is that theoria is the highest exercise of our understanding. Now, it's translated in the last section of this reading as study, which is kind of misleading. You just imagine that means going to the library or preparing for exams or something like that. What he's talking about is maybe better captured in this idea of contemplation. Doing philosophical activity, engaging in contemplating the highest things. So here's a picture of Plato and Aristotle engaged in philosophical debate about the nature of unchanging things, the essences of things. Now, the reason why he thinks that's the highest activity is because we have this desire for knowledge. That's an important part of the kind of beings that we are. And so there are different levels of that, different levels of exercising that sort of function that we have. So there are just basic forms of knowledge, like the things that we can know just by looking around using our senses. We know that it's raining outside, for instance. There are also, there's a kind of skilled practical know-how. There's a kind of knowledge or know-how that comes with experience. So if you're an experienced rock climber, for instance, or you're an experienced nurse, then there's a kind of technical know-how, which comes when we study a discipline and we learn the principles. So if you, say, go to med school and you learn what the causes of different kinds of illness are and why certain kinds of medicine and treatment help that. There are productive kinds of arts like medicine or engineering, different things like that. They're all important and they're practical. But Aristotle actually thinks that it's the theoretical activity that's the highest, because that's the kind of stuff we do for its own sake. It's the kind of knowledge we pursue not because it's going to help us achieve some certain goal, like building better bridges or healing more people, as important as those are, but it's knowledge that we want for its own sake. It's the questions we ask because they're intrinsically interesting, the questions of philosophy. And Aristotle says this is the most fully human activity, and it's also the activity that is most akin to the divine, to the gods, because it's studying the kinds of things the gods would be interested in, and it's activating that part of the soul that seems to be most godlike, which is nous, or understanding. So with these things in mind, you're ready to start reading the Nicomachean Ethics, and I will see you after you've read it to talk about it in the next lecture.